plug around my Badger air compressor made it easier than ever to add a full airbrush kit to your painting. Holy fucking hammer. If you hate the idea of investing in an airbrush, or if you already own an airbrush but find yourself avoiding the hassle of using it, you are not alone. Yes, using one of these handy dandy little tools is the ultimate hobby flex. It's what separates the mere tabletop standard painting mortals from the display level painting Golden Demon winning gods. And I hate it. I own several airbrushes and a decent compressor. I use them extensively in my painting. Yet I still feel significant stress anytime I decide to take the airbrush route in my painting projects. Today I'll discuss the physical and financial barriers to investing in an airbrush, as well as the psychological barriers to using an airbrush now that I own one. And just to be fair, by the end of the video I will explain why I continue to keep this frustrating little piece of equipment on my painting desk. Welcome to Treehane Miniatures. I feel like we should start at the beginning, a time when I didn't own an airbrush and swore that I never would. I was new to miniature painting and voraciously consuming any miniature painting YouTube content I could find. I always felt discouraged when I found a miniature painting tutorial that I wanted to replicate, only to discover that the artist used an airbrush to achieve the results. I mean, I could barely paint with a regular brush at this point. What business do I have investing in an airbrush? I should probably just focus on one skill at a time. I'm painting solely for the purpose of getting color on my miniatures for gaming. A regular brush is fine. Thinning paints, glaze consistency, base layer consistency, highlighting for maximum contrast, and using washes are all still new concepts to me. I don't need to throw the concept of using an airbrush on top of this mess. At this stage, miniature painting is intimidating enough without the added learning curve of using an airbrush. In addition to acquiring the skills necessary to use an airbrush, another barrier is simply having to buy additional hobby-specific equipment. Now, I'm not going to include price as a barrier here. As of this recording, I can buy an airbrush and compressor from a reputable company with everything I need to get started for $68. I can also regularly find acrylic paints and even airbrush-specific paints for less than $2 a bottle. Considering that the whole prohibitive cost of entry argument usually comes from slap choppers who are more than willing to spend $5 or more per bottle of speed/contrast paint, I find this to be a disingenuous argument. However, buying more equipment can increase the burden of the hobby in other ways. I have to find a place to store the new equipment, adding to the clutter of my hobby. I have to establish a dedicated place to use the airbrush, which will require adequate ventilation. Plus, the more hobby-specific equipment I own, the less I use each individual piece of equipment. My time is finite. If I'm using an airbrush, I'm not using my standard brush, and vice versa. And speaking of needing a dedicated space, this can be a real issue for many people. A garage or patio works great as a well-ventilated space for airbrushing without the need for additional equipment, but not everyone has access to these. If I choose to use an airbrush indoors, I'll need some sort of ventilation equipment, which is an additional cost and adds to the clutter of the hobby. So if I was so resistant to getting into airbrushing, why do I now own 4 airbrushes and a large compressor? Well, here's a quick backstory to bring us up to where we are today. And this is where my story will differ from most other airbrush painters. You see, the airbrush just kind of fell in my lap. I have a relative who used to be a chocolatier and used an airbrush to spritz gold flake and other decorations on top of chocolate candies. When she retired, she no longer had a use for her air compressor. She knew I was into miniature painting, so she offered to give me her air compressor. It was a cool little Badger air compressor without a pressure tank. The price was right, so I figured, why not? I'll give this airbrush thing a go. I bought a cheap airbrush for $16 and a $7 air hose, and I was all set to start airbrushing for an initial $25 investment, and almost no effort. If it wasn't for somebody handing me a free air compressor, I probably still wouldn't own an airbrush. Since then, I've had to replace the compressor, which gave out after a couple years, and I've purchased 3 additional Gaahleri airbrushes after deciding to take airbrushing seriously. So this brings us up to today and the hangups I still have about using the airbrush equipment at my disposal. I currently have a dedicated painting area and my airbrush equipment is always set up. Still, the little effort it takes to get going and start airbrushing is a major deterrent for me. I pull my DIY spray booth forward to the front of my painting desk, I pick up the airbrush and its holder off the floor, and most annoyingly, I set up my cleaning station. This includes having some water handy along with a pipette and an old brush for cleaning the airbrush cup. I also need some airbrush cleaner. And I need a container to hold the waste that's generated from cleaning the airbrush. This isn't the greatest of chores, but I definitely feel it. In addition to this setup, there's a matter of actually cleaning the airbrush itself. I flush and clean the airbrush between each color I use, sometimes more frequently if I'm using one color for an extended period of time. This procedure is fairly straightforward. I flush the paint out of the cup with some water. I add more water and scrub the insides with an old paintbrush to loosen any paint that's stuck to the inside of the cup. I then use airbrush cleaner to perform a backflow cleaning. Finally, I spray airbrush cleaner through the airbrush into this airbrush trap. This takes only a couple of minutes, but I may have to do it several times within a single painting session. From a time-saving standpoint, it is completely irrational for me to complain about the hassles of setting up and cleaning the airbrush. The time I save using an airbrush when compared to a standard brush is immense. For example, if I want to create smooth blends on the skin of a miniature with an airbrush, it takes about 3 minutes of actual spray time, plus about another 10 minutes of preparation and cleaning. So in just 13 minutes, I can get some great looking results using an airbrush. Achieving the same level of blending with a standard brush would probably take me over an hour. I'm saving a ton of time, so I should have nothing to complain about. That's the analytical evaluation of the situation. But it's not that simple. Art is emotional. It's a hobby that's meant to be enjoyed. I think the main issue with my airbrush example here is the work to fun ratio. You see, if it takes me 10 minutes of work for 3 minutes of fun, then I see this entire process as being mostly work. I don't want my hobby to be mostly work. I get that this is a purely emotional response to the situation, but it's hard to get motivated to start a project that is 3 times more work than it is fun. Another potential negative is that the airbrush can feel very impersonal. Whereas painting with a standard paintbrush is a zen-like meditative experience for me, using an airbrush can feel very mechanical. When I paint with a standard brush, I become lost in the process. I become lost in my art. Painting with an airbrush can feel like I'm turning my art into a manufacturing process. I'm blasting paint at the miniature from a distance. It's far less intimate. This is a very subjective take on the airbrush as an artist's tool. Many will see this mechanical process as an overwhelming positive as they crank out a horde of painted miniatures in record time. So if I'm talking all this shit about airbrushes, why do I continue to use them? Well, there are some things that the airbrush is just much better at doing. It's great for priming miniatures indoors during the winter. It won't supplant a rattle can for convenience, but sometimes it's the best option. It's great for underpainting light values on a miniature before applying colors with a standard brush. Typically, this is done as a grayscale zenithal highlight. This simple light value gradient also easily translates into painting light values on a miniature in full color, such as building up highlights on skin. And of course, the airbrush is unmatched in laying down the foundation for OSL on a miniature. I think that the main trick to using an airbrush more frequently is to remove as many obstacles as possible between the airbrush itself and actually using it. Now, we've already discussed that cost of entry isn't really a barrier anymore. The cost of a reputable complete airbrush kit that includes the airbrush, compressor, and hose can be found for $70–$80. The clutter component has also been greatly reduced, as can be seen with the small packages like the Gaahleri Ambition series. Gaahleri sent me this Turbox Mini to check out, which is even smaller. This is an observation and not a recommendation at this point. Gaahleri isn't paying me to show you this, and I don't accept payment for any videos I make. I will run this thing through some actual painting applications to see if it's a valid entry point for individuals new to airbrushing. Once you've decided to acquire an airbrush, the next thing to do is eliminate the barrier between the airbrush sitting in its box and you actually using it. The best way to do this is have a space dedicated to the airbrush. Having an air compressor tucked under a painting station and out of the way with a hose that leads up to an airbrush sitting on the painting desk is about as convenient as it gets. If this setup is feasible for you, I'd recommend getting a decent size air compressor with an air tank. If you don't have to move the air compressor, the size doesn't really matter. If using this in your primary residence, I'd recommend an airbrush specific compressor since these are generally quieter than the industrial type compressors. If you're in a multi-story dwelling with people living below you, having an air compressor like this sitting on the floor may not be the best idea. I'd consider the next option. If you don't have a dedicated space for your hobby, I'd recommend one of these much smaller options. Now, I used to lug around my Badger air compressor along with all of the equipment I needed in a single bag. I'd set up a painting station outside in order to airbrush, and it was a major pain in the ass. Today I'm looking at what I hope is a better option for a mobile airbrush unit, or for individuals who don't have a dedicated space and need to set up their equipment every time they want to airbrush something. Gaahleri sent me this new Turbox Mini to check out. This complete Gaahleri airbrush kit is much smaller and lighter than the little Badger air compressor I used to lug around. I'm going to put this Gaahleri Turbox Mini through its paces on a couple of similar miniatures. I'll paint one miniature using only what's included in the box, and I'll paint the second miniature using 3 different brush sizes. I'll use a 0.2mm airbrush, a 0.3mm airbrush, and a 0.5mm airbrush to see how this little compressor handles the different nozzle sizes. In both cases, I'll run primer, standard acrylic paint, and airbrush-specific acrylic paint through the airbrush. First of all, this kit comes with the GAD39 airbrush, which is the exact airbrush I purchased for myself exactly 1 year ago. I've purchased 3 Gaahleri airbrushes over the past year, and I've been happy with every single one of them. My personal history with Gaahleri products is the only reason I accepted this Turbox Mini unit from Gaahleri. I'm fairly confident that it's going to be an effective and reliable product. I don't talk about shit on this channel that I'm not willing to put my own hard-earned money behind. That being said, this is my first look at this thing, and you're along for the ride. You'll see my experience with this unit as it unfolds. The air compressor is tiny. Well, actually, I think Gaahleri refers to this unit as an air pump. I don't know how much confidence that really instills in me, but I don't know, maybe it's just semantics. This kit also includes a power supply and an air hose to get me up and running right out of the box. First, I'm going to paint with a variety of airbrush sizes. I'm beginning with a 0.5mm GAD39 to prime the miniature. Now, I had intentionally left this little air compressor in the lowest pressure setting so I could show you all how easy it is to increase the pressure by simply pressing the dial on the unit a couple of times. But being old and forgetful, I started priming without increasing the pressure. This is why you see the nozzle pressure dropping to about 3.5 psi as I prime the miniature. I'm honestly shocked by the adequate flow of the primer I'm getting at such a low pressure, but I did feel that something was wrong. I soon realized the error of my ways, and I increased the pressure to full. The nozzle pressure reads 10.5 psi as the paint is flowing, and around 28.5 psi static pressure when I'm not painting. The volume of paint this is producing definitely feels like a full-size compressor set at 28 psi, despite what the digital display reads while the paint is flowing. Next, I switched to my Mobius 0.3mm airbrush, and now I'm using Pro Acryl standard acrylic paint. I keep the pressure high, and the airbrush performs exactly as it should. With this nozzle wide open, the display reads 10 psi. It seems that the smaller the airbrush nozzle opening, the higher the pressure reading. This makes perfect sense, well, for fans of Bernoulli's equation anyway. As I moved to my smallest airbrush, a Mobius 0.2mm airbrush, I switched to Vallejo airbrush paint. For this 0.2mm needle, I need to put the air pump in compatibility mode. This setting is for airbrush needles 0.2mm and smaller. This setting will reduce the number of start-stop cycles the pump performs as I'm painting. This setting with a smaller brush maintains a pressure of about 18 psi wide open. I'm sure that the viscosity of the paint I'm using will also have some impact on the PSI reading. Once again, the little pump performs flawlessly. For the next miniature, I'm going to use only the 0.3mm airbrush that came with the kit. I run some primer through the airbrush first. Yeah, both of these miniatures were already primed black, but I wanted to make sure I tested primer through this system as well as regular paints. Next, I used the same airbrush with standard acrylic Vallejo paint. Once again, no issues. Finally, I used the stock airbrush for some Vallejo airbrush paint. The included airbrush is just as accurate as any of the others I own. I didn't experience any hiccups from either the airbrush or the compressor in this kit. The results on both miniatures look just as good as what I've achieved with my larger compressor and Mobius series airbrushes. I'm going to keep using this for a while, and I'll give an update if I run into any issues. I'm not saying that this little kit is going to change your mind if you're dead set against airbrushing, but Gaahleri has made it easier than ever to add a full airbrush kit to your painting arsenal. And I do have a discount link in the description below that'll give you 10% off products on Gaahleri's website, including sale items. If you're interested at all in seeing what they have on offer, this discount link is a great way to go. And with that, I'd like to thank my amazing channel members for supporting what I do on this channel. You too can become a member for as little as $1.99 per month and receive perks such as early access to videos, extended versions of our painting tutorials, and even a tier that lets you decide which miniature I paint next. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.